sign if you can hear me? Great. Can people hear me? Someone put a thumb up. There you go. Thanks, Harold. Welcome. This is getting exciting since we're almost done with the human condition. It's a long book, and we've been reading it for a while. Someone has their microphone. On because I'm hearing a feedback. Put it off. That would be great. Excellent. Thank you. So I want to begin today by reminding us a little bit of the beginning of the book and trying to take these admittedly probably the most philosophical and for some people therefore the most difficult portions of this book and put them back in the context of the book. So if you'll turn all the way back in the book to page 6 of the book, which is in the prologue, we remind ourselves that at the end of the prologue, Hannah Arendt writes, "However, the modern age is not the same as the modern world. Scientifically, the modern age, which began in the 17th century, came to an end at the beginning of the 20th century. Politically, the modern world in which we live today was born with the first atomic explosion. I do not discuss this modern world against whose background this book was written." So it's important to understand for us trying to read this that she makes a distinction between the modern age, which is really the scientific age of the scientific revolution that begins with the event of Galileo's discovery of the telescope and has as its two main thinkers Descartes and Leibniz. The purpose of the historical analysis, she says then, is to trace back modern world alienation, its twofold flight from the earth into the universe and from the world into the self, to its origins, in order to arrive at an understanding of the nature of society as it has developed and presented itself, at the very moment when it was overcome by the advent of a new and yet unknown age. So if we try and make sense of this, there are two parts of the book, right? There's the part in which she says, looks at the general human capacities which grow out of the human condition and are permanent, that is, cannot be irretrievably lost so long as the human condition itself is not changed. And those are labor, work, and action. And then there's a historical component of the book, which says that in about the 17th century, with the rise of the scientific revolution, a whole new age emerged, the modern age, which had two enormous consequences, which she calls world alienation and earth alienation. So chapters 3, 4, and 5 are about labor, work, and action. And then we hit this chapter called the Vita Activa and the Modern Age, which is not the modern world, but modern age. And so it's the scientific revolution. And so what this is, and this book is an attempt to understand the way that the scientific revolution has led to two things: earth alienation, the flight to the universal, and world alienation, right? The flight into the self, from the world into the self, and how these two things are challenging, threatening, and in ways creating unexpected problems for the human condition in which people labor, work, and act. And so we began chapter 6 last week, and we had a first chapter on world alienation. And that was about the way in which we lose the close at hand through mapping and through the expropriation of the peasantry from the land. And then the second chapter, chapter 36, which begins the question of earth alienation, which she says is even more important and more determinative of our world than world alienation. That's on page 264. When she says that, earth alienation has remained the hallmark of modern science. And if we remember, the event of earth alienation is the discovery of the telescope by Galileo. And what does the discovery of telescope by Galileo do? Well, on the one hand, it brings all things to our mind with the certainty of sense perception. But the sort of counterintuitive point that Arendt is making is that by making things certain to us on a micro level, on a telescopic level, we come to lose our faith in our ability as human beings to know and understand the world. It's actually a challenge to our senses, at least our senses as a matter of common sense. And thus, the triumph of the scientific age, which lets us know more and more and more, is always accompanied by what she calls the despair of the scientific age or the modern age, in which we are ever more acutely aware of the way in which we don't know and we don't fit into the world. This leads us to where we are, chapter 38, the rise of the Cartesian doubt. I assume many of you know about Descartes' idea that I think, therefore I am, and that I think, therefore I am is an answer to his idea of universal doubt, the doubting of everything. And from Arendt's point of view, Descartes' universal doubt, the doubting of everything, is the philosophical corollary of Galileo's discovery of the telescope. The telescope changed reality. It made reality something we can't trust, and we have to look always beyond the world we see in order to understand things. To understand the table, we have to look microscopically at the electrons and the wood and the composition. To understand the cosmos, we have to look again beyond our senses, but also to understand human relations. We have to look at the laws of psychology and the laws of economics and the laws of neurochemistry and biochemistry now that show us that the way we act isn't simply self-evident, isn't based on what we think and know as human beings in the world, but is something we always have to question. And so we end up with this kind of radical doubt. Now, for Descartes, the radical doubt is an attempt to solidify certainty. It's to lead to the one certainty that we can have, which is that I am. As she points out, Descartes doesn't actually prove I am. He proves that my thoughts are. And that's something she takes from Nietzsche. But in any case, he largely is an attempt to prove I am, and thus that I know something, and thus that in this certainty that I am, I can then go out and know the world as a modern scientist. That's the attempt of Descartes' philosophy to ground, in a sense, modern science. But it fails, Arendt argues, that what he really does and what science do, and they both work hand in hand in this, is that they lead to the loss of trust in the senses and in appearance of the world, and thus in truth. The point is that if all must be doubted, even the self-certainty that I exist is in the end only something I know, in myself, in my mind. It's not something I know in the world. It's not something I know in reality. And so the world, in a sense, retreats. And all we can know is self-certainty, and not any truth about the world. This, she says, is a blow to human confidence. This is on page 276. And it shows us that humans are inadequate to receive or to know the truth of the world. These are complicated passages. I'm happy to talk about them, but that is the sort of core of what she wants to say in this chapter. That insofar as all I can know is what I think, where are my thoughts? They're in my head. I can know nothing truthful about the world. And thus, I can know nothing truthful about the reality. And so all I have left are the scientific virtues, right? What are the scientific virtues? Of hard work, diligence, and honesty. And so reliability becomes the virtue of the scientific age, that I'm reliable in my method of science, but I can never actually know anything about the true or objective world. Okay, I've gone quickly through this. I don't know how much Descartes people know or want to know. I can point us to one or two passages if you'd like, but why don't I see if there's any questions and see where people's thoughts are leading in this.
Hi, Roger.
Yes, hi. Hi,
yes. Can we say that the consequences of this radical doubt from Descartes, from a moral perspective, not in the field of knowledge, of knowing the world and enabling the scientific age, that there are strong moral consequences which lead to the nihilism? Is this one of the roots of the nihilism, possibly according to Arendt?
So yes, thanks, Krista. The answer is clearly yes for her. The loss of any certainty, or not certainty, of truth about the world, means that, and we'll get to this in the next chapter as well. That's what the real part of the next chapter is that all knowledge, all truth becomes something that's in my head, is internal, is subjective, and the opposite of subjective is often objective. But what she thinks the opposite of subjective here is common, is that which is shared, and thus, just like my knowledge of the tree now is internal and based on sensations in my head, and I can only know that I see the tree. And if you see a tree also, I don't know if you see the same tree I do, but we both come to know that what we see as the tree is based on internal subjective ways our mind works, and we could rethink the way our mind works. We could reprogram it. We could change it. This is what a lot of neuropsychology and neurobiology is trying to do right now. And so from Arendt's point of view, everything outside us becomes doubtable, uncertain. And of course, that includes moral standards. So she'll say on page 278 that the top, right after the little footnote 35, the radical change in moral standards occurring in the first century of the modern age was inspired by the needs and ideals of its most important group of men, the new scientists. And the modern cardinal virtues, success, industry, and truthfulness, are at the same time the greatest virtues of modern science. The point is, we can't know the truth of the world. All we can know is the industry, success, and truthfulness of our methods. Are we honest? Are we going through it correctly? And so we can't actually know where it leads as to be true about the world. There's a zeal for truthfulness, she says. We want truth, but that's because we are ever aware that we don't know it. Just a quick comment on that, Christo. So nihilism, remember, means nothingism. It means, and what it really means is that there are no highest truths. It doesn't mean there aren't truths. It means there are no highest truths. It's the Umwertung aller Werte, the devaluing or the revaluing of all values or worths, as Nietzsche puts it. What nihilism says is there are lots of truths, but none of them are the highest truth. And that means there are lots of opinions about truth, and there are lots of claims about truth, but there's no one truth that trumps all the others and that we all can agree on. And so this radical doubt shows that there's no one truth we can all agree on, and that is the fundamental beginning of modern nihilism. Are there other questions? Bob Meyerson writes, Descartes goes into it's a joke. Goes into a bar and orders a drink, and after he finishes it, the bartender asks if he would like another one. Descartes answers, I think not. Poof. Yes. The problem with the joke is that the I think not has as little impact on reality as the I think from an Arendtian perspective. Both the I think and the I think not are about your consciousness, not about your physical reality. And that is the point Arendt is making, is that to prove that your consciousness exists says nothing about the visible or appearing world. Which is why she will say that what Descartes does is it lays the foundation for a mathematical reality, not an apparent or an apparent reality. And that's an important distinction that she wants to make here. Are there other questions about chapter 38? Okay, we can always come back to it. Let me move on to chapter 39. So chapters 39 and 40 now try and take the insights that she has just offered from the analysis of Descartes and Galileo and apply them to the world. So remember the context that this whole chapter on the Vida Activa in the modern age is within, which is the context of world and earth alienation. World alienation is the retreat from the world into oneself, and earth alienation is the retreat from the earth into the universe. And the claim here is that Cartesian introspection, what does introspection mean? The spection is to look around inside. We stop looking around out there in the world and we look inside for our truth. It's the retreat from truth in the world to truth in our head. And this Cartesian introspection begins us on this path of seeking truth in ways of thinking, logic, and not in a common shared world. And so man concerns himself, she says on page 280, long before the natural and physical sciences, this is about 8 or 9 lines into the chapter, began to wonder if man is capable of encountering, knowing, and comprehending anything except himself. Modern philosophy had made sure in introspection that man concerns himself only with himself. I am. That's the beginning. And everything else follows from that and is on the basis of an internal, introspective thought. Now, the first part of that sentence may seem strange to people, But if you look at the footnotes throughout these next two chapters, you'll see that a lot of the footnotes are to 17th, 18th, 19th, and even 20th century scientists. And her argument, overarching argument, is that that Descartes' turning inward, the world alienation from the world to the self, has been mirrored and has been adopted by natural and physical science, such that what scientists study is not the world that appears, but is simply the world as it hits upon our senses and as it lives in a logical universe, a thinking universe. Those of you who know the uncertainty principle, that is a big part of what she's talking about. And she cites Heisenberg repeatedly throughout these two chapters. The idea being that we set up an experiment to measure and find what we are looking for. We find what we're looking for, and therefore we say that's how the world exists. It's actually not engaged with looking at the world and trying to understand it. It's trying to see if the world fits into our mathematical, logical theories. And the result of that, the reason for that is because we all know that we can't trust the world. We have come to be suspicious and doubt our senses, and thus the reality of our bodily sensual existence. And so we have become increasingly internalized. So much so that our entire thinking about the world, philosophically and scientifically, has become internalized. And so if you continue to read there, right after the footnote, man, in other words, this is again on 280, man, in other words, carries his certainty, the certainty of his existence, right? I think, therefore I am, within himself. It's within himself, not outside himself. The sheer functioning of consciousness, though it cannot possibly assure a worldly reality given to the senses and to reason, confirms beyond the doubt the reality of sensations and of reasoning, that is, of reality of processes going on in the mind, right? Not anything about the outside world. We see, she says at the bottom of this paragraph on page 281, the seen tree, right? The last sentence, the seen tree may be real enough for the sensation of vision, just as the dream tree is real enough for the dreamer, as long as the dream lasts, but neither can ever become a real tree. We talk about what we see and what we dream, but we don't talk about reality. And this then leads to, as Christo was just asking, a kind of nihilism in the sense that we also doubt the goodness of the world. The point here is that we doubt that the world has any sense or meaning. We ask, well, if the world really is simply in our heads and we're making it up, then how can it be a purposeful, good world, right? This is the theological question of what's called a theodicy. Is there a truth to theos, a dikere, a truth to God? Did God create the world so that it would be good? And this becomes a problem because if we might have been deceived forever, it's not at all clear how the world that we're in has any particular goodness to it. The result of this that I think is most, there's a lot of intricate points here, and I don't want to get lost in them, but the result of it and what's important for us to remember, and this is on 283, right, is that Cartesian reason, this is the top of 283, is entirely based on the implicit assumption that the mind can only know what it has itself produced and retains in some sense within itself. Since anything we sense from the world can be deception and can deceive us, all we can really know is what we make, is what we produce. And thus the only thing we truly trust is pure logic or mathematics. But notice, not mathematics as the ideal forms given outside the mind. That's called geometry. Not geometry, but algebra. Only the forms of mathematics and the mind that are purely abstract and symbolic. And that she then cites Alfred North Whitehead, who's someone she cites a lot throughout this book. And his book, Science in the Modern Age, is without a doubt an essential book to read if you really want to understand Hannah Arendt, I think. Who writes that the outcome of common sense is the outcome of this modern scientific theory and this modern philosophy is that common sense is in retreat. And here's where she brings in the word common sense, which is an essential word for anyone who wants to understand Hannah Arendt. Common sense is the sixth sense, right? We have five senses: hearing, seeing, touching, smelling, whatever the fifth one is. And common sense is the one that unites them all together, gathers them together. And it helps us understand the world that we see. But she says it fits us into a common world. The sensus communis, which is an Arendtian term that she takes from Immanuel Kant in some of her later work, is an attempt to talk about what is it that holds us together in our judgments and our sense of what's right and wrong about the world, what's beautiful and not beautiful, what has good taste and bad taste. And what we increasingly have in common is not the world, she says, but the structure of our minds, right? Which, of course, is not something we can have in common because each one of it is our minds. And so, as she says in footnote 44, the transformation of common sense is into an inner sense, and it is characteristic of the entire modern age. Okay. I'll stop again and ask if there are questions here. These are difficult chapters.
Excuse me?
Yeah, go ahead. Hi, Maurizio.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought up Whitehead because I noticed in some previous chapters and now I'm struggling with her use of Whitehead because Whitehead's critique of Cartesian reason is actually substantially different because he was interested in Whitehead anyway was interested in Descartes' split between primary and secondary causes, which he called the bifurcation of nature. So, for instance, the atoms and the electrons that make up a red flower, and the abstraction of red, which Descartes, assigned a secondary cause, and so decrease that importance, right? And Arendt seems to be coming at it with a different angle, and it seems there to be a little bit of a friction because it's sort of like, what does she mean to follow Whitehead in saying that there is a unity between sort of what is in our minds and the mechanical universe of physics? Or is she trying to say that, is she critiquing the split between abstraction and substance as Whitehead does, or is she reaffirming it? Because I think when she repeats, say, Marx's definition of science as the split between appearance and being and so on, it's hard to sort of translate, for me anyway, just how she is using Whitehead, and it just for whatever reason it just seems unclear and suspicious to me in some respects because she's sort of it's hard to say if she's really faithful to what Whitehead is saying.
That's great. So this is one of the ways that Arendt works, right? She takes from people. She's Whitehead is not a major thinker in her canon that she's trying to articulate his theories. She finds his book helpful, and yet Whitehead's trying to do something very different from Hannah Arendt. Whitehead's a scientist and trying to make an argument about how science works. Arendt simply thinks Whitehead's a good scientist, and he's a philosophical enough scientist that he understands that what science has done is separate knowledge from the world, being and appearance, and that she takes him seriously on that. So what you're saying about the only part of the book of Whitehead's book that really needs to be read for Arendt are the introduction. She's not trying to read his scientific theory, but she thinks he's one of those scientists, along with Heisenberg and Schrodinger and a couple of others, who understand that what science is doing is a radical reimagining of man's purpose and relation in the world, such that man is no longer trying to understand himself in a physical world and trying to understand the physical world, but man is now reaching a point where he can look beyond the physical world by turning into himself and begin to not only see the world logically, that's the first step, and confirm the world as a logical world based on his experiments, which come out of his logical theories, but can eventually start to remake the physical and natural world, right? Insert cosmic processes, as she said in chapters 37, and in a sense, create the world anew. There is a distinct possibility, right, that we will re-engineer not only certain things like water and mountains, but the earth itself and even humans, right? That's the whole promise of mapping the brain and cloning the brain and actually re-engineering the brain through biochemistry and engineering principles. And what she's saying is that is rooted in a contempt for reality, a distrust of reality, and a drive for the certainty that only comes from an internal way of seeing the world. Obviously, Whitehead doesn't want to say all that, but he's a good enough scientist from Arendt's point of view to understand that increasingly science has less and less connection to the natural, physical, appearing world, and that's true in every branch of science. Is that a fair answer from your point of view as a Whitehead, someone who knows more about Whitehead than I do?
Well, I think it would be interesting to go into the library and to see what she highlighted from Whitehead, and also to search from the footnotes to see how elaborate. I think you're probably correct that she's really interested in deploying him strategically to make a larger point about our world. So yeah, that's very satisfactory. Thank you.
I mean, if you look at, she also cites Heisenberg a lot. She doesn't cite Heisenberg's, essays in physics journals. She cites his Wandlungen in den Grundlagen, in the sort of wanderings in the groundwork of mathematics and natural science. She's interested in the philosophical approach that these physicists and thinkers take to the world. And they begin to see that their scientific assumptions have changed the way we relate to the world, the good ones. And she's simply pointing that out and saying that all of this is based in a world alienation and an earth alienation, which have their ground in the 17th century birth of science and thus the modern age. Are there other questions?
Roger.
Yes. Please.
Yeah. On page 281, she mentions the problem of the Dieu trompeur of Descartes, so the deceiving God.
Yes.
And in relation with, what about goodness of the world and goodness of God himself? I find this very intriguing and very difficult, but what strikes me maybe from this page, do you think that she tries to, from Descartes' perspective on this deceiving God possibility, to explain what she will think about radical evil? Or do you make a connection between this idea raised from the radical doubt of the possibility of a deceiving God to then the enigma of the radical evil that she tries to address from Origins to Eichmann and even in Life of the Mind?
Yeah. It's a question I haven't put to myself exactly in that way. So it's a good question. The radical doubt here of a deceiving God leads philosophers like Descartes and Leibniz to prove the existence of God, right? But to leave unproven the goodness of the world that God has produced. Both of them, in order to make that next step and to show that the world that God has created is a good one, rely on a deus ex machina, a God outside the machine, so that for Descartes, thought and matter are connected, and for Leibniz, the world as it is must be the best of all possible worlds. Otherwise, God would not have created it. A good God would not have created it. And there must be a God, because if we go back in the series of events, someone had to create the world, and it must be a God. And so they both rely on this deus ex machina to sort of save the pre-established harmony, or to save the logical connection of the world. In doing so, they also inject a kind of radical doubt into the world. And so is that related to radical evil? I mean, so radical evil, that as Arendt understands it in the first time she uses it in the Origins of Totalitarianism, is more along the Kantian sense of just sort of the lack of good, the not knowing of good, but also the horrific doing of evil. And in the Eichmann book, the banality of evil is, and its new radicality is, that it has no depth, right? That it's superficial, that it exists only on the surfaces, and that it's in a sense thoughtless. So the question is, what is the connection between that kind of superficiality and banality with the with radical doubt? There is a connection, right? Here it is. What radical doubt does is it isolates us. I think someone might have. Can you hear me? Yeah. What radical doubt does is it isolates us in our minds, right? All we can know is ourselves. It separates us from the world. It separates us from those around us. It separates us from religions. It separates us from communities, traditions, families. peoples, etc. And it in the end reveals us, except for those of us who are the strong scientists who can revel in doubt and seek through scientific method to know things, it leaves most human beings in the modern age homeless and rootless, and in the end subject to feelings of meaninglessness. And as Nietzsche says in the Genealogy of Morals, man can endure all sufferings and pain as long as he feels that there's a meaning for them, that there's a sense to them. And what radical doubt does as it infests itself into society is it creates this sense of homelessness, this metaphysical ennui, this existentialist angst that we hear so much about in the 19th and 20th centuries. And this leads people to want to latch onto systems of meanings, movements, ideologies that provide truths and make their lives meaningful. So I'm a Nazi, and the success of the Nazis shows that I'm part of a movement that is meaningful. I'm an environmentalist. I'm a civil rights worker. All of these movements, all these are ideologies that, for Arendt, are ways that people who are homeless and rootless give sense to their lives. And in doing so, they adopt one system of thought that explains everything. And anything that doesn't fit in to that system of thought, they exclude. And if it keeps persisting, they have to erase it or kill it or eradicate it. And it's those kind of people who latch on to ideologies that, for Arendt, are superficial, who resist the depth of the world and seek to impose a simple ideological explanation on the world. And so the connection of radical doubt and this internalization and world alienation to banality of evil is that what radical doubt and world alienation do is create a sense of meaninglessness, homelessness, rootlessness that leads people to embrace systems of meanings like ideologies and thus simplify their worldviews. There you go. Is that all right, Christo? I don't know if you were looking for a more direct connection, but that's how I see it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. The last chapter on thought and the modern worldview. Again, these three chapters, it's good that we're reading together. They all go together. The point is that we have, in removing ourselves from looking at and thinking about the world, which we no longer trust because it's deceptive, into ourselves, we remove the Archimedean point from anywhere in the universe into ourselves, into the mind of man. And when we do that, we free ourselves from any given reality, from given reality altogether. That is, from the human condition of being an inhabitant of the earth. It is both world and now earth alienation. We exist almost in a vacuum, which is why people like Ray Kurzweil and many of the transcendentalists and transhumanists now are arguing that, we are part of a singularity with the universe, right? That when we succeed in merging man with machine, and when we succeed in creating man as a purely thought entity without a body that exists maybe in a computer, but in the end is really simply just at one with the intelligence of the universe, which is a quote from Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, we will become unearthly. We will become part of a hive mind that is the intelligence of the universe. That will be, for Kurzweil and for the transhumanist, the ultimate triumph of science, because it will free us from all deception of physical reality and lead us to a pure universal thought, right? That's, I've said this before in this course, but I take Kurzweil with incredible seriousness, not because I think he's always right, but because he has a philosophy and a religion and a worldview that is I think, logical conclusion of the modern scientific age. And it is the pure internalization of all reality such that we become pure thought. And that pure thought triumphs, and yet it doesn't lead to a certainty about the world. And thus, and this is where I think Kurzweil falls short, we still need the deus ex machina of Descartes. We still want to live in a world, and yet his goal is to fully exit it. And so this chapter is about thought and the modern worldview, in the sense that thought becomes the driving force, such that our drives and our desires are to actually remake the real world, the actual world, according to different thoughts and theories, right? So, I mean, if the human body is not a good enough shell for us, we want to, through nanotechnology and genetic technology and neurobiology, rewire it with drugs and implants, etc. If the earth has environmental problems and is not a good enough earth, we want to, in a sense, replace the dirt of the earth with nanotechnology dirt that pulls up carbon dioxide, right? This is what people are working on now. We want to replace the rivers that maybe are too polluted with self-cleaning water, right? And this, I think, I think it's undoubtedly true that all of this is going to happen in the next 20 and 30 years. And so what Arendt is saying is science has ceased trying to understand the world, and it's more and more about making the world in our image conform to how we want it to conform. And that this is deeply, deeply rooted in the modern scientific age. I mean, she wrote this, remember, in 1958. I mean, this is stuff that Heisenberg and Schrodinger and a few other scientists had really started to think about, but she was the first non-scientific thinker, I believe, who really began to understand this and understand it in a meaningful cultural and philosophical and political way, in a way that she saw threatened the human condition of labor, work, and action, because it threatened to remake what humans are and how humans are as earthly and worldly beings, subject to chance, vagaries, and the givenness of reality. On page 287, she writes, Cartesian doubt, logically the most plausible and chronologically the most immediate consequent of Galileo's discovery, was assuaged for centuries through the ingenious removal of the Archimedean point into man himself. Namely, we had doubt, but we then had certainty about ourselves, at least so far as natural science was concerned. But, right, here's the but, the mathematization of physics, such that physics doesn't look and try and understand the world, but tries to, A, reduce the world to mathematics, but then, of course, the opposite is true, mathematically figure out what the world is, and then test the world to see if it fits with our theories. The mathematization of physics, by which the absolute renunciation of the senses for the purpose of knowing was carried through, we no longer need the senses at all, had in its last stages the unexpected and yet plausible consequence that every question man puts to nature is answered in terms of mathematical patterns to which no model can ever be adequate, since one would have to be shaped after our sense experience. This is a key point. The models that we now have for the universe, whether it's string theory or quantum physics, etc., simply are not adequate and not comprehensible by the human senses, because they're not from our human senses. And they are from a mathematical structure that has no bearing on how we as humans experience the earthly world. And it's at this point that the connection between thought and sense experience, inherent in the human condition, takes its revenge, right? We suddenly no longer have this connection, being and appearance part company for good. And then at the bottom of the page, she can write, scientists formulate their hypotheses, right? We have an hypothesis, string theory, to arrange their experiments. We test for it, and then use the experiments to verify their hypothesis. During this whole enterprise, they obviously deal with a hypothetical nature. You actually never deal with nature. You deal with nature as seen through the experiment, which is why Heisenberg says in modern physics, man never encounters nature, he only encounters himself. And Arendt is taking that Heisenberg insight and combining it with her reading of Galileo and Descartes and saying that they're all connected in this basic experience of world alienation and earth alienation that has its origins in the scientific age, the scientific revolution. She cites in footnote 51 Erwin Schrödinger, and it's worth reading that footnote. As our mental eye penetrates into smaller and smaller distances, right, micro and nano technology, and shorter times, we find nature behaving so entirely differently from what we observe in visible and palpable bodies of our surrounding that no model shaped after our large-scale experiences can ever be true. No humanly thought model based on a language that is grounded in senses and human experience of the world can be true to the mathematical scientific reality. Thus, we have then a divergence between the visible appearing world and the true world, being and appearance part company. And on the next page, on 288, the first sentence, she says, in other words, the world of the experiment seems always capable of becoming a man-made reality. Right? We can actually make the world of the experiment, the being world, the true world, real. And this, while it may increase man's power of making and acting, even of creating a world, we can make the world new in our image, like God's, right? And far beyond what any previous age dared to imagine or dream. It puts man back once more into the prison of his own mind. The point is, again, we create a world from out of our mind, not in the world we're in. This is the alienation of man from a common world into an individual world, which is the root, as we were talking about earlier, of world alienation and thus homelessness, rootlessness, which leads to the ideological power of modern ideologies, because what ideologies offer is a sense of place and purpose in a world that makes simple sense, even if it doesn't conform to the complexity of the true world. And so this is the basis for ideologies, and thus the evil as a banal evil, right? That's a great question that Christo asked, because it puts it all together. So we got about six minutes or so left. I'll stop there and see if there's some questions that we can talk about. Are there any particular passages you found interesting, or questions, or problematic? Is this? You can also say this makes no sense and ask me to try again. Go ahead. I hear someone talking. Someone want to say something?
Yeah, this is John Bevan, calling. I'm a scientist, and so I'm not a philosopher. I've never done any philosophy courses, and I've only read very, cursorily in it. As a scientist, I find all this, very disturbing, for obvious reasons, I think. But one of the things that I find especially disturbing is that there doesn't seem to be any sort of separation between science per se, what's often called like pure science, and applied science, because most of what I see in the world, and the alienation, I see it in practical terms as applied science, and applied by people who are not really scientists, but who are entrepreneurs and manufacturers and people making money, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, one of the things that Heidegger actually says it somewhere, and I think Arendt would agree with it, is that all true scientists are philosophers. In the sense that all true scientists are actually questioning the relation of man and the world in ways that are important and fascinating. So, the point is not that Heisenberg and Schrödinger and Leibniz and Descartes are causing anything. That's actually not the claim at all. It's that they are, as brilliant thinkers, seeing some important truth about the world. And the claim is that the modern age starting in the 17th century, things began to be seen before that had not been seen before. And it's certainly not the case that Schrödinger or Heisenberg or Leibniz or Descartes were thoughtless or ideological. That's the farthest thing from the claim to be made. And practical scientists, what sometimes we call, the plumbers, the people who make this and make that, are also not necessarily ideological. They just use the science that they have to do what they have been employed and taught to do. This is not an anti-science book. I hope that I didn't make it seem like it was. It's not anti-science and it's not anti-technology. It's simply trying to grapple with a problem about humanity that the scientists and the philosophers have together identified, namely a loss of faith in our common world. That has its roots in the undoing of the medieval culture that was very rooted in certain truths of religion and tradition and family and medieval communities. And out of that, and out of the rise of the telescope and the rise and the distrust of our senses, led to both philosophy and science to increasingly distrust the common world and turn inward. That's a truth that we have to deal with. And from Arendt's point of view, all thinking people, scientists and philosophers and everyone else now, has to be aware of it and address it and confront it if we're going to avoid the kind of thoughtless superficiality that someone like Eichmann and many others represent. But I don't know if you were interpreting this as an anti-science text, because it's not.
What I'm reacting to is the emphasis on the effect of the telescope, say, she mentioned two main factors, two other factors in making the modern world, the discovery of America and the Reformation. And these were other influences which have not been discussed so much in these three chapters.
That's an excellent point. And we should say that there are probably thousands and thousands of examples she could have picked. She picked these three for particular reasons. And she's in America, the mapping of America, but I think it fits the Reformation. They all fit together for her. Why does she focus on the telescope? I think the answer is I give two or three answers. One is she was a philosopher and she's interested in philosophy, and Descartes and Galileo and Leibniz were all philosophical scientists, and she knows that tradition better than she maybe knows the exploring tradition. So that's sort of the contextual answer. But I think there's more to it than that. I mean, for better or worse, the world we live in now is a scientific world. It's a world that's, if there's, the Reformation has changed religion, and that has been important. Mapping has changed our relation to the earth and the world, and that has been important. But there is simply, when you ask someone today, well, how do you find the truth? The answer is science. It's not philosophy or map making or religion. And if you want to understand the modern world, which she says comes after the modern age, is the world we're in now, you can't do it without deeply understanding the modern age. And from her point of view, and here she agrees with people like Nietzsche and Heidegger and Whitehead and Descartes and many others, the modern world is the scientific world. And the point is that more so than map making and more so than the Reformation, the telescope has deeply impacted not only scientists and philosophers, but the common person's understanding of their world. Namely, we don't trust our senses. That is for her the overwhelming experience of living in the modern age. We don't trust what we see, whether it's about our brain or about the table or about the computer. We all know that the sun doesn't revolve around the earth. We all know that when we look at something and we hear something, it could be deceiving us. And thus, we have lost our faith in truth and lost our faith in the common world. And that experience for her is the dominant experience of what it means to be human in the 21st century. And that comes from science. It's related to map making and it's related to the Reformation, and we could come up with other things too. But its ultimate root for her is in the scientific insight that our senses are not to be trusted.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that.
Yeah. We're a little over time, so I'm gonna end here. I want to thank you all. We're almost done, and for next time we're gonna read 41. We're gonna begin now. We've now finished. You don't need to thank me. We finished the part on science for now, and now we come back and we look at how science has impacted the human condition, labor, work, and action, and the relation of the vita activa with the vita contemplativa. And so if remember that labor was about life and work was about world and action was about freedom, we're going to see the inversion over the period of the modern age and the modern world of those relations, so that freedom drops down and the concern with life moves up. So that may be a little hint of how to read the next couple of chapters. And we'll see you next month. Thank you all very much. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.